In the autumn of 1879, in the high plains of the Dakota Territory, people watched a cast-out man do something that made no sense. He was stacking bones around his cabin. Not firewood, not sod. Bones, bleached, broken, hauled in by the wagon load from a killing field 20 miles east, where the great herds had been slaughtered down to nothing in 3 terrible years. He built them into a wall, row on row, packing the gaps with prairie grass and clay, until his small cabin looked less like a home and more like the ribcage of some buried beast. The town called it Larson's Boneyard. They were wrong to laugh. By the time the coldest winter on record reached the Dakota Plains, the thing they mocked would be the only warm place for 30 miles. But that's getting ahead of the story. Because before there was a wall of bones, there was a man named Soren Larson, and a debt he owed to a winter that had already taken everything from him once. Stay through to the end, because the way this story closes, with a knock on a door in the dead of night, is the kind of thing this whole town remembered for the rest of their lives. Would you have laughed at a man surrounding his home with the bones of dead animals? Or would you have wondered what he knew that you didn't? Subscribe now, because by the time the answer comes, the valley will already be buried in snow. Soren Larson had not always been an object of ridicule. 3 years earlier, he had been ordinary, a homesteader with a wife named Greta and a cabin no different from the others scattered along the creek bottom. Ordinary until the winter of 1876, when a storm came down out of Canada with no name and no mercy and froze half the territory in 4 days. Greta had gone out to the barn for milk and never come back inside warm. Soren found her 11 feet from the door. 11 feet. He never stopped counting that distance. After that, something in him went quiet and stayed quiet. He sold off half his cattle, kept to himself, and spent 2 winters studying every wall, every windbreak, every method of holding heat that any old-timer in the territory would tell him about. He was not chasing comfort. He was chasing the 11 feet. He was determined that no door of his would ever again be too far from warmth for someone he loved. So when the autumn of 1879 came and Soren Larson began hauling buffalo bones up from the killing fields, the town did not see a grieving man trying to keep a promise. They saw a man losing his mind in the open. The bones came from where the great herds had been run to slaughter, thousands upon thousands of skeletons left to bleach under the sun, picked over by collectors who shipped them east by the train car load for fertilizer and bone china. Soren paid the bone pickers 50 cents a wagon load for what they considered worthless leavings, the ones too broken or too small to sell. He stacked them in rings around his cabin walls, skulls, leg bones, ribs, packed 2 and sometimes 3 feet deep, and filled every hollow with dried buffalo grass and river clay until the whole structure stood like a second wall wrapped around the first. The mockers gave it a name fast. Lund Pedersen, who ran the grain store and never missed a chance to needle a man down on his luck, started calling it Larson's Boneyard within the first week, and the name stuck to every tongue in town like cockleburr. Boneyard Larson, they'd say, tipping their hats with a smirk when he came in for nails. His own neighbor, a widow named Agnes Thorvald, told anyone who'd listen that the man had finally cracked from grief, building himself a tomb before winter even asked for one. Soren said nothing back. He nodded, paid for his nails, and drove his wagon home to keep stacking bones. Silence, he had learned, was its own kind of armor. But the idea was not madness. It was memory. Years before, as a young man freighting goods along the Missouri, Soren had wintered one season with an old Mandan trader named Otto Heyer, half German and half something older than anyone could put a name to, who had spent 4 decades living along the river through winters that killed lesser men. Otto kept his own dugout wrapped the same way, not with bone, that winter, but with packed earth and hide and anything thick enough to break the wind before it reached the wall. Soren remembered sitting by Otto's stove one January night while the wind screamed outside and barely stirred the flame inside, and asking the old man how he'd survived so many brutal seasons in a country that killed everything soft. Otto had looked at him with the patience of a man who'd buried friends in worse storms than the one outside, and said the words that Soren would carry the rest of his life. The cold doesn't come through a wall, boy. It comes through a gap. Find me a wall with no gap, and I'll show you a man who never freezes. It was not stone, not sod, not bone in particular that Otto had been teaching him. It was the principle underneath all three. That thickness alone meant nothing if the wind could still find a seam to slip through. A wall had to break the air completely, layer after layer, until the cold lost the thread and gave up looking. Soren never forgot it, and when he stood in the killing fields 3 winters after Greta died, staring at bone piled high as a man's shoulder, stretching toward the horizon in every direction, he understood that he was looking at the cheapest, thickest, most available wall material in the entire territory, for the price of a wagon and a strong back. The most respected man in the valley was a builder named Hans Reuter, a German stonemason who had raised half the solid structures in 3 counties and never built a wall that failed. Hans did not laugh at Soren. That was the thing people remembered later. Hans never once joined the mockery, not even when Lune Pedersen tried to draw him into it outside the grain store one afternoon. Instead, he rode out to the Larson place on a grey October afternoon, climbed down from his horse, and walked the perimeter of the half-finished bone wall with his hands clasped behind his back, the way he inspected any structure before he'd put his name near it. He crouched twice to press a thumb into the packed clay, testing how it gave, and once tapped a knuckle against a half-buried skull, the way he'd tap a stone to listen for a hollow crack inside it. Bone is hollow, Soren, he said finally. Hollow holds moisture. Moisture freezes. Freezing splits whatever's packed around it. And your wall fails from the inside, where you can't see it failing. It was not an insult. It was the honest warning of a man who had watched moisture destroy stronger materials than bone, who had seen mortar crack and stone shear from a single hard freeze-thaw cycle, who had rebuilt 2 chimneys in the valley after exactly that kind of slow, invisible failure. And mice, Hans added, almost as an afterthought, though every homesteader in the territory knew mice in a wall in winter were no small matter at all. Bone's marrow draws them like nothing else. You'll have a wall of tunnels by January, and tunnels are just gaps with fur in them. Soren listened to every word without arguing. He had no answer yet that would satisfy a man like Hans Reuter, only a conviction and a debt to 11 feet of frozen ground, and a determination to prove it could be done right. Before he rode off, Hans paused at the gate and added one more thing, quieter than the rest. I hope you prove me wrong, Soren. I do. I just don't think you will through the back half of October and into November. Soren built. He started at first light and worked until his hands went numb, hauling bone by the cartload from the killing fields, sorting it by size at the wall's foot, the dense leg bones and skulls toward the bottom for structure, The lighter ribs and vertebrae layered higher, where weight mattered less. The first week was nothing but hauling 11 miles each way to the killing fields and back, the wagon groaning under bone that clattered and shifted with every rut in the trail. His team of 2 mules earning their oats twice over by the time the snow finally threatened in earnest. He worked alone. No hired hands would take the job once word spread of what it was for. And even if they would have, Soren preferred it that way. This wall was a debt being paid, and a man did not hire out his debts to other men. He learned quickly that raw stacking invited exactly the gaps Otto had warned him about decades before. So he changed his method. Each layer of bone went down wet with river clay, worked thin as paste, then packed solid with dried buffalo grass stamped in with a wooden mallet until no daylight showed through from the inside. Pull a bone into place, pack the clay behind it, tamp the grass tight, pull, pack, tamp, over and over 10,000 times across 2 months, until the rhythm of it lived in his hands even after he'd gone to bed at night, his fingers twitching through the motion in his sleep. He measured as he went, the way Hans Reuter would have measured, though no one was there to see it. The bone and clay wall growing to 30 inches thick at the base, tapering to 22 near the roofline, standing a full 18 inches clear of his original log wall, so that a dead air pocket sat trapped between the two, doing work neither material alone could do. He drove 4-inch spacer blocks of scrap pine between the log wall and the bone wall every 6 feet, just enough to hold the gap true, and let him check it with a stick as he went, never letting himself crowd the bone in tight against the logs, no matter how tempting it was on a freezing afternoon to close the distance and call the job finished early. His palms split and bled in the cold mornings, the rough edges of broken bone tearing through what was left of his calluses by the 2nd week. He wrapped them in rags soaked in tallow and kept working, because a man with frozen ground waiting outside his door in 6 weeks did not have the luxury of healing first. 3 cords of dry grass went into the packing before the first snow ever threatened. Cut and dried through the long days of August when he hadn't yet known what he'd needed for, only that an old instinct told him to put up more than the cattle would eat. He spent $11 on clay he couldn't dig himself from frozen ground later, plus the wagon loads of bone at 50 cents apiece, plus the nails and lumber for the inner frame that held the bone wall true against the wind. Money that should have gone toward cattle feed, and every dollar of it felt to his neighbors watching from the road, like proof the man had truly lost his senses. By the time the first hard frost came in late October, the wall stood waist-high all the way around the cabin, and from the road it looked, in the grey autumn light, exactly like what the town had already named it, a boneyard, built by a man burying himself alive before winter could do it for him. The first failure came in mid-November, on a night when the temperature dropped without warning to 11 degrees. Soren woke near midnight to a smell he didn't like, damp and sour, coming from the northeast corner of the bone wall, the side that caught the worst of the prevailing wind. He took a lantern out into the cold and found it exactly where the smell led him. A section of packed clay had gone soft and begun to slough, and beneath it, where moisture had pooled and frozen and thawed and frozen again, exactly as Hans Reuter predicted, 3 feet of bone and grass had slumped inward, leaving a gap a man could put his fist through. His stomach dropped, he thought, standing there with the lantern shaking slightly in his torn-up hand, that perhaps the respected builder had been right all along, and he had wasted a season and a season's wages on a grieving man's foolishness. He stood there a long while in the cold, the lantern guttering, fighting the old familiar pull toward giving up entirely that had nearly taken him in the months after Greta died. But he made himself look closer before he made himself believe it. The failure wasn't in the bone. It was in the drainage. He had packed the clay flat instead of sloping it, and meltwater from a warm afternoon had pooled instead of running off, then frozen and split the seam from within. He tore the whole section down to the log wall and rebuilt it over 4 brutal days, working through a cold snap that left his water barrel frozen solid by the second morning, this time sloping every course of clay outward like a roofline, so water would always run away from the wall instead of pooling inside it. He tested the new slope with a bucket of creek water before he packed a single bone back into place, watching it run clean off the clay rather than sit and soak. And only then did he trust the method enough to rebuild. The wall could bend. It did not have to break. By the time he finished the repair, the section stood stronger than anything else on the cabin, and Soren understood that the wall, like grief, like a man, had to be tested to find out where it was honest and where it had only looked solid. By the first week of December, the wall stood finished, ringing the cabin from foundation to eave. 30-some tons of bone and clay and dried grass between Soren Larsen and whatever the sky still had coming. By August, he had only the idea and the killing fields. By October, the wall stood waist high and the town had its name for him. By the first week of December, it stood finished, 18 inches of dead air sealed between bone and log. And Soren allowed himself, for the first time in 3 years, a single quiet evening that wasn't spent working. His niece Mira, Greta's sister's girl, had taken to riding out from town on Sunday afternoons that autumn. The only soul, besides Hans Reuter, who never once called the wall by its mocking name. She was 7, and she asked the question every child in these stories eventually asks, the one the grown-ups had stopped being able to ask honestly. Will the bones really keep the cold out, Uncle Soren? They're just bones. He set down the mallet he'd been cleaning by the stove and thought about it the way he thought about everything now, slowly, with the weight Greta's absence had taught him to give to small things. It isn't the bones that keep the cold out, Mira, he told her. It's the still air between the bones and the wall. Cold can't cross a space that doesn't move. You give it nothing to push against, and it just gives up looking. She didn't fully understand it, not the way Hans Reuter would come to understand it later with his palm against the warm stone, but she nodded the way children do when they've decided to trust a grown-up's certainty over their own confusion, and went back to warming her hands by his stove. He had a dog by then, a quiet, watchful blue heeler named Boone, who had wandered onto the place half-starved the spring after Greta died, and never left. Boone had slept by the hearth every night of his life on that homestead. But in the second week of December, without explanation, the dog stopped sleeping by the hearth and moved his blanket to the spot against the bone wall instead, the northeast corner, the rebuilt corner, the strongest section in the whole structure, and would not be coaxed back, not even with the scrap of bacon Soren tried tempting him with on the coldest of those nights. A dog does not flatter a wall. Soren noticed and said nothing. But he noticed. Around the same time, the geese that usually held the creek until late December lifted off 2 full weeks early, in long ragged lines pointed hard south, and didn't come back down to rest the way they normally did, vanishing from the valley entirely by the 14th. Old Agnes Thorvald, who had outlived 2 husbands and a dozen Dakota winters, stood on a porch one gray afternoon and told her grandson the wind smelled wrong. Not cold exactly, but still, in a way that made the hair stand up on her arms. The kind of stillness that usually meant the sky was holding its breath before it let something terrible go. Nobody in town could have said exactly what was coming. They only knew, the way animals and old women always seem to know first, that something was. The air went dead still on the 18th of December and stayed that way for 2 full days, and not one bird crossed the sky in all that time. Even the cattle in Loon Pedersen's barn stood bunched and silent against the back wall, refusing their feed, and a man who had farmed that valley for 20 years later admitted he had never once seen livestock behave that way before a storm that hadn't even arrived yet. It came down out of the north on the night of December 20th, 1879, what the territory would remember for the rest of the century as the Black Wind Winter, the storm that buried 3 counties and didn't loosen its grip for 11 straight days. The temperature fell to 41 degrees below zero by the second night and held there. Wind drove sideways at 50 miles an hour, carrying snow so fine and so hard it scoured paint from barn boards and stripped bark from fence posts. 26 inches fell in the first 30 hours alone, and the drifts that followed buried fence lines, wagons, and in 2 terrible cases that the territory newspaper would later report, men who had stepped outside their own doors and lost their bearings within seconds. It was not a storm in the way a man understood storms from milder country. It was a verdict. Nature had arrived, and nature never negotiated its verdicts. Cabins up and down the creek bottom, sound and solid by ordinary standards, began losing the fight within the first night. Fires roaring in their hearts and still losing ground. Frost creeping inward across log walls. Water freezing solid in buckets 6 feet from the stove. Loon Pedersen would later tell anyone who asked that his own stove ran hot enough to glow at the seams that first night. And still by morning his children's water glass on the table had frozen solid through. The storm asked only one question of every structure in its path. Can the wind get in? Most of them, built honest and built well by any normal measure, had never been asked that question quite this hard before, and most of them answered wrong. On the second night of the storm, with the temperature still falling and the wind screaming loud enough to drown a man's own thoughts, Soren woke to a sound he recognized instantly as trouble. A thin, high whistle from somewhere along the north wall, the unmistakable voice of moving air finding a seam it shouldn't have. Boone was already at the door, ears flat, refusing to settle. Soren pulled on every layer he owned and went out into a whiteout so total he could not see his own hand at arm's length, working by feel along a rope he'd strung from the door to the woodpile weeks before, just in case a night exactly like this one ever came. The wind hit him sideways the moment he cleared the doorframe, hard enough to drive the breath back down his throat, and for one staggering step, he lost the rope entirely and had to drop to his knees and feel for it in the dark before he found it again, his heart slamming against his ribs harder than the cold alone could explain. He found the trouble by touch before he found it by sight. A vent cap near the roofline had iced shut from his own breath, and the stoves, and the pressure building behind it had begun to force a crack down through the packed clay beside it, widening with every gust like something alive, testing for a way in. One bad step on the ice along that wall, and a man could go down in a whiteout and never find his own door again. Soren knew men in the territory who had frozen 11 feet from shelter, doing exactly that. And the thought did not leave him as he worked. His free hand gripping the rope so hard, his knuckles ached straight through the mitten. He chipped the vent clear with a hatchet handle. 3 sharp strikes, and then a fourth before the ice gave way. His bare fingers screaming in the cold the moment he pulled his mitten off to feel for the crack's edge. He packed the widening seam with grass and clay he'd kept thawed by the stove for exactly this possibility, working fast before the paste could stiffen uselessly in his hand, tamping it tight with 3 short strikes of his palm, the way he'd tamped 10,000 times before. Pack, tamp, check. It took him perhaps 11 minutes. Out there alone in 41 below, with the wind trying to take the rope from his hands. It felt like the longest 11 minutes of his life since the one that ended 11 feet from his own door 3 winters before. When the wall held, he stood with his back against the bone and the wind screaming past him, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that he had finally done something the storm could not simply walk through. He followed the rope back inside, and Boone was waiting exactly where the dog had slept every night since December began, against the rebuilt corner. The strongest section in the whole wall, as if the animal had known all along which part would be tested first. The storm broke on the morning of the 11th day, and what it left behind told its own story without a single word from Soren Larsen. Snow stood in drifts as tall as a man on horseback along the north fence lines, and 2 homesteads further up the creek had lost livestock entirely, their barns having failed sometime in the storm's worst hours. Hans Reuter rode out on the first passable morning, less out of curiosity than obligation. A builder, checking on work he'd warned against, the way an honest man does. He brought his own thermometer, the good brass one he used for curing mortar, and Soren handed him a second one, without a word, the cheap tin one he'd nailed outside his own door 18 inches from the bone wall. Hans took the readings himself, refusing to trust another man's word on something this important, crouching to read each one twice before he'd commit to a number out loud. Outside, in the lee of the wall, 9 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, where the stove had burned low and steady through 11 days on less than half the wood Hans himself would have predicted necessary, Soren had used 9 logs where Hans would have guessed 20. The second thermometer read 61 degrees, warm enough that Soren had been sleeping without his coat by the 3rd day of the storm. The numbers required no interpretation. Hans Reuter pressed his bare palm flat against the inside face of the bone wall, the warmth of it rising plainly through stone-cold fingers, and stood there a long moment before he said the only thing the moment required. I was wrong. 4 words, plain as frontier men ever spoke them, and they carried more weight than any speech could have. Still air, Soren told him quietly. That was the whole secret. No different in principle from the dugout he'd wintered in years before. Not the bone itself. The dead, trapped air between 2 walls that the cold could never quite find its way through, layer after layer, until the wind simply gave up looking for the gap. Hans nodded slowly, turning the principle over the way he turned over a piece of stone before he trusted it to bear weight, and said he'd be a fool not to build the next one the same way. The knock came 2 nights later, well after dark, while the second smaller storm of that brutal December was still working its way through. Soren opened the door to find Lune Pedersen standing in the snow with his wife and 2 children behind him. the grain store's stovepipe having cracked clean through in the cold and left their own home unlivable in a matter of hours. The man who had coined Larsen's boneyard stood there with frost already whitening his eyebrows, too proud and too desperate to manage more than a few stammered words about needing a place for the children, just for a night or two, until the worst passed. Soren did not remind him of the name. He did not let the silence stretch a beat longer than it took to step aside from the door. He simply said, "Come in," and took the smallest child's coat to hang by the stove and set water on to boil without another word about it. Because vindication, he had learned somewhere between Greta's death and this storm, was never something a man needed to say out loud to make it true. Lund's children slept that night against the same northeast corner where Boone had taken to sleeping weeks before, and in the morning the youngest asked, in the unguarded way of children, why the wall felt warm to touch when every wall she'd ever known felt cold. Soren only smiled and told her to ask her father, who had already learned the answer the hard way. Agnes Thorvald arrived the following morning with 2 more families from down the creek, the bone wall by then having become, without anyone announcing it, the only reliably warm structure for 30 miles in any direction. Soren took them all in the same way, without a word about who had laughed and who hadn't, because the wall had already settled that argument better than he ever could have. By the time the second storm passed, 11 people were sleeping under that one roof, and not one of them left without thanking him, though he waved off every thanks the same quiet way he'd waved off every insult months before. By the following autumn, the whole valley had begun building the same way. Hans Reuter himself adopted the method into 3 new homesteads he raised that year, refining the clay slope technique Soren had discovered by accident in his own failure. And by the time the next decade turned, builders from as far as the Black Hills were asking after what they had started calling the Larsen Wall. Bone where bone was cheap and plentiful, stone or sod where it wasn't, but always built on the same trapped air principle a grieving man had learned from an old trader on the Missouri River and proven against the worst winter the territory had ever recorded. The Territorial Agricultural Bulletin printed a short notice on it in 1882, crediting S. Larsen's method of dead air insulation in language so dry and official it would have made Otto Heyer laugh out loud to hear his own riverbank wisdom turned into a government pamphlet. Nobody in the valley remembered the laughter anymore. Not really. They remembered the thing that worked. Lund Pedersen's grandchildren grew up calling it the Larsen Wall, without ever quite knowing there had once been a crueler name for it at all. And Mira, grown by then with homesteads of her own to raise, told the story to her own children every winter the way Soren had once told it to her by the stove. Not as a tale about bones, but as a tale about still air, and about a man who paid an old debt the only way he knew how. The strongest protection a man can build is rarely the one that looks strongest from the road. It is the one built honest, tested by failure, and proven by the cold itself, rather than by anyone's opinion of it. Soren Larsen never gloated, never once reminded a single soul of what they'd called him, and never needed to, because the wall did all the talking that needed doing, in 61 degrees against 41 below, for as long as anyone in that valley was still alive to remember it. So here is the question worth sitting with tonight. If your neighbor started stacking something strange and ugly around his home, something the whole town agreed looked like madness, would you have laughed along with everyone else? Or would you have been the rare one willing to walk over, look closer, and ask him why?